Absolutely.
Okay, so Daisy, you've recently published research, and I've got to read this out, it's quite a long time, but faster, greener, cheaper, dealing with IT infrastructure complexity in a hybrid cloud world. And I think at least one of the main findings of that was that legacy infrastructure is proving a significant headache for a lot of IT professionals over the issue of sustainability. So perhaps you can just
It,
expand on that.
it, it is, yes, indeed. I mean, I think, having surveyed around 250 or so senior decision makers, so think CTO, CIO, so on, it's very much front of mind. I think something like 64% said that their legacy infrastructure is causing them a sustainability nightmare. I mean, it's a little bit emotive, but I think that's what I'm observing when I'm out in front of our customers as well. And legacy hardware it plays a huge part of that. Yeah, indeed.
But I suppose the good news, I think, is that most, if not all of them, said at least they did have some kind of a sustainability plan in place or
Mhm.
some targets. Is that right?
They do, and I think perhaps historically there's been the focus on simple carbon reduction. So you know think of your scope 2 emissions, so your power consumed. But I think what we're seeing now as well is people are also focusing on their scope 3. So if you like, their the upstream and downstream effects of their hardware. Um, I think it's also really important to think about it that this is driven perhaps not just by a cost reduction drive, but also if you think about investors and the ESG play from investment and being able to show your credentials, that's massively important. And also employees. If you think about the workforce today, and I'm sitting here in my sort of late 50s, but much of the workforce is younger than me, and of course they expect their employers to be doing the right thing as well. So it's kind of a virtuous circle, I think. If you can save your costs and your money, on that day-to-day basis, but then you can attract the right skill sets into your, with your employees, and also then do the right thing to attract the right investment, then it works all around.
But I suppose I mean, that's the positive bit that maybe that not quite so positive was that although you have the people saying, yeah, we've got plans, but I think there were rather less of them were confident or convinced that they were actually going to hit the targets or get where they needed to be. Is that fair or is it not that?
I think certainly that was what was reported. I mean, perhaps around about a half said they were confident, which of course by deduction means that half weren't. And I think some of that is constraint, perhaps on a budget side of things. They know what they need to do, but there are competing tensions. In terms of investment to make any kind of material change, and that could be as simple as capital spend, but it could also be much more broad. In terms of a change of strategy. Perhaps there's a significant on-premise footprint of hardware, and they're suffering from that. And it could also be the application estate. It's often not that simple to make a change and and change your applications to run in an optimum way.
But a lot of people, I think, back to the sort of the legacy infrastructure challenge.
Mhm.
I think a fair amount of people, and your research confirmed it, seem to think that the cloud is a good way to sort of overcome that legacy. Is that
I,
correct thinking? And I mean, is it all upsides, or are there sort of the odd thing to be aware of as well, I suppose?
yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Broadly, um, but I suppose there's also the question over that definition of cloud. I mean, it's eluded us for many years, hasn't it? Um, in that, the cloud can apply equally to on-premise services as much as it can to public cloud. But it's more about the way that you consume it. And if you can deploy your workloads, your applications in such a way that you can consume them flexibly. So think of the obvious case of, I don't know, a retailer where you have, peaks from, let's say, Black Friday all the way through into January. But for a lot of the year, your commerce systems aren't, working at full capacity. You need the ability to flex back. And I think that is really the beauty of cloud consumption models. And of course that's available, not only in the public cloud, thinking of the classic Azures and AWSs of this world, but the major hardware vendors now. If you think about HPE, particularly with their GreenLake model, where it's a flexible capacity model, it does allow you to deploy on-premise but still get those benefits. So really it's about considering where your workload needs to be, and then taking the best option. But of course, that hybrid model is probably something that needs to be more consciously addressed, rather than perhaps sort of during the sort of the first parts of the pandemic, where people became hybrid cloud unconsciously because they needed to acquire resources very quickly, because they were changing shape, at the time. But I think as we go forward, the hybrid model is probably the way that most of the IT industry will go.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how clearly every organization will vary slightly, but is it fairly obvious as to what applications belong where, or can that be a fairly complicated sort of journey?
It can be. I suppose the way that we address that at Daisy, as an example, with one of many MSPs, is that it's a question of looking at the estate as it stands today, understanding the workloads themselves, how do they flex over time, but also their architecture. Sometimes they're not suited for running in public cloud. Other times they make absolutely perfect sense to be running in public cloud. So it's not a really simple equation, I suppose, but with some, diligence to understand the interdependencies, where data needs to live, I suppose the elasticity or the scalability, the flexibility that you're going to require. So I suppose, again, going back to our retailer, if you like, then the web front end for consumer ordering and purchase is going to need to be particularly flexible over time. But perhaps a CRM system might have a more even workload over the year, or the finance system, for example. So you can start by looking at the business use case, but you do have to bear in mind the nature of the application itself as well. Is it suitable today, or do you need to consider some future changes?
And just back to the sort of legacy IT focus. So there's obviously potentially an environmental cost to sort of using older technology, but also financially. I mean, potentially, if you're running old, inefficient hardware, that there's a cost associated with that. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yes. I think there was a study done by the Uptime Institute a little while ago, and they'd assessed that something like 40% of servers in use are 5 years old or older, but they carry out, I think, 7% of the workload, but use 2/3 of the power that's consumed in an IT estate. So, in a really simple equation there, you're simply spending too much money on your power and cooling, and adopting more modern hardware with far higher density, greater processing power, making use of perhaps GPU processing, re-architecting your applications to a modernized delivery mechanism, does tend to lead to vast reductions in power consumption. We had a top 20 university come to us to look at a refresh of their estate, and they were expecting to reduce their power consumption by around about 72-73%, and on a sizable estate, the return on investment was pretty quick, and in fact the power reductions paid for that refresh in effect.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because a lot of IT departments are under financial pressure, either to reduce budgets or to try and do more with the same. So again, is it fairly obvious or easy to discover if you do refresh IT hardware to understand the sums as to keeping with the old legacy stuff, where obviously you don't have any capex, but the opex is maybe very high, as opposed to, I guess I think what you said there, it's the payback period, I guess. Is that easy to establish when you're sort of weighing up?
I think it is. There are some very useful tools out there, across the hardware vendors and indeed in the public cloud. And I think all of the vendors are making great strides in the way that they capture the power consumption, all the various contributing factors to sustainability or performance. You can do it up front, clearly by running workload assessments. You can it's just simple mathematics, I suppose, to translate old processor capability into new processor capability, and ensure that you're optimizing your workloads. I think there's also a historic problem where often hardware was not being utilized as well as it might be. Perhaps the typical utilization rates of 40 or 50%. Maybe that was a little bit of reticence in the past, because people were sort of trying to build in the peak capacity, but of course flexibility takes that problem away. But I think with the available tooling to capture all of that information, you can also monitor that over time, and then using things like, I don't know, I suppose bringing AI to the fore, AI ops for optimizing workloads, making sure you've got the right balance across your estate, perhaps even moving workloads to allow you to power down servers and parts of your estate when it's not required. You may have made the investment, but at least you're not using the power. There's an awful lot of tooling out there to bring to the table. And of course, the key thing about all of this is going back to the sustainability side of things. Being able to report accurately and then monitor your progress over time is going to be really important to businesses too.
Yeah, you mentioned AI ops there. I've sort of followed that quite closely, and it seems to have morphed into observability as a word has sort of replaced it. But I'm just intrigued as to where it's at, because it was talked about a few years ago, and I won't say went away, but then I say observability became a very popular thing. A lot of people talk about what is it able to achieve now, and into the future, how much automation and intelligence, as you say, via machine learning AI, will it bring to bear on the situation?
Yeah, I think on the I think on the sustainability side, it's probably all a bit indirect. If you think about using AI for recoding for more efficient code base to reduce the impact on power consumption, that's one angle. I think reductions in human input for I suppose hygiene factors, like firmware and patch updates and so on, and achieving those at the right time. But I think also understanding the patterns in utilization and then determining workload placement. I think there's a use for that as well. And it's I suppose it's forever evolving, and of course one of the other sides here, it's we're slightly on a different thread, but the ability of AI to gather information and interpret patterns beyond, I suppose, immediate human recognition, and starting to have sort of positive effects in the world of cyber, and the protection of the estate is going to be important. I think it's quite a broad brush thing, and I think it's still really early days from what we're seeing, but often it's around efficiency from perhaps the human perspective, but I do think there's a part to play in terms of workload management in the future.
And so I suppose if there's a key message to glean from the research, it's around this consumption-based IT infrastructure model, almost certainly being part of, if not the main or the whole solution to both, I guess, the sustainability angle, but also potentially some financial rewards as well. Is it that clear cut? Is it that simple?
I think so. If you cast your mind back to I don't know, perhaps 10, 15, maybe perhaps let's say 20 years ago, when public cloud wasn't a thing, right? And if a business wanted to look at its IT estate, it would have to resource for peak, because you didn't want to be running up to, let's say, Black Friday and then think, I need to acquire another dozen servers to satisfy the workload. Because the lead times wouldn't work for you. But of course, once you've acquired them for the next 4 or 5 years. And I think having the ability to place your workloads in the right place and then pay for what you consume, it has that financial benefit. But it also means that once you go past peak, being able to power down, power off, remove your subscription, in a public space, for example, and then bring it back to sort of a lower level for the remainder of the year makes perfect sense. And indeed, thinking around the HPE GreenLake model, by setting your commit rates at the right level, you have the ability to burst into capacity and then bring it back when the peak is passed. I think that consumption-based computing is absolutely the way forward.
As a matter of fact, also, do the cloud providers in general operate, I won't say at tighter margins, but make more use? So you were mentioning, I think earlier, 40-50% usage of a server, for example. And my background years ago was storage, and as soon as the storage was 50% full, people started getting nervous. Oh, we need some more storage. But that still means there's 50% to go, which in my mind is a huge amount. So do the cloud providers take it up to sort of 70-80% before they get nervous, if you like? So there's just better use of assets? Or
absolutely. I think they're much better versed than individual organizations typically, in terms of that capacity management. I think the other angle, of course, from their perspective is scale. if you think, for a small to medium enterprise that might have, I don't know, dozen a dozen virtual hosts, if you need to increase or make use of, or expand by any sort of percentage, adding a node is 1/12 of your estate. Incremental changes to the public cloud providers with tens, hundreds of thousands of nodes, it means they can be far more granular in their growth path and their capacity management. And of course, they've also got variability between regions, so they can move resources around much more easily than individual organizations. And I think you do see that benefit. I think there's another side to it, of course, is that they have the luxury of being able to essentially bespoke build their infrastructure, on sort of a modular basis as well. So if they are seeing demand in, I don't know, UK South, take Azure for an example, and they're seeing demand for much higher memory utilization, they can backfill that, pretty quickly, but it's done on a modular basis rather than standard nodes that individual organizations might purchase from a vendor.
Okay, and maybe if it's possible to, so a lot of organizations are potentially, starting out or early on in this journey. They've recognized that legacy infrastructure is very restrictive in say financially, sustainability wise, etc. Any thoughts or advice as to the sort of things, what needs to be done to get you starting on the road to this? Because presumably you don't just switch overnight from everything legacy and maybe on-prem to everything sort of consumption-based model. Just your thoughts as to how to manage that process.
Yeah, I think it is, as in the vernacular, it's a bit of a journey, I suppose. But the first thing you've got to understand is your workload, what it is, how it's put together, what does it consume, where does it consume it from, but also you've got to align that to your business strategy. If you think about acquiring hardware, if you need to acquire it because there are reasons for you to have on-premise equipment, you need to understand how you're going to minimize that, and how you're going to take advantage of public cloud. But I think it's about assessment in the first place. Is a lot of organizations that we talk to, there is, if you like, a corporate strategy, which is great. There are, I suppose, initiatives or outcomes that are given to the IT function, and they will go away and do a great job, but it doesn't necessarily, the end game doesn't always match. So I think it's really important to understand the business strategy over a medium to long term cycle. And then if you take the hybrid model and you implement it in such a way that you have the observability that you talked about across the entire estate, then I think being able to move applications as hardware cycles out, as the applications are updated or upgraded over time, to then reach your optimum operating environment is probably the way to do it. I think, I think the big bang, as it were, is not necessary, and can probably be a bit too disruptive as well when you think about it. I think, getting a really good picture of what today looks like and understanding what 12 months, 24 months, 36 months needs to look like for the business, and then prioritize your decisions about what you need to change in a way you're going to get the best return over time. I think that's the way, is just take it as a sort of a fairly controlled approach, but key to it all is getting a true understanding of what you have, how they interact, and where those benefits are going to be.
And in terms of your customers, I imagine they're all on different stages of that journey.
Mhm.
But is it fair to say that most people are still fairly early on? Because as you often read things, or you just imagine that you're the only organization that isn't doing all, whether it's digital
Mhm.
transformation, everyone else is doing it and you're falling behind. But it's the reality that the majority of people are still fairly early on, so one shouldn't become too depressed at the task ahead, or
Oh,
is it, well, where are
yeah.
folks, I guess?
No, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's not. I think perhaps the great examples that we see, about organisation X achieved this by, going to the public cloud and so on and so forth. Of course, they're real highlights, but actually they're one of thousands and thousands of organisations. They show the art of the possible. But you're quite right. We have organisations that are, have been through that journey. We've got organisations. I think, there's one in the NHS, and they've been with us for many years, and they've gone from on-premise to private to shared, hosted, and they're just about to embark on a further transformation process into Azure. But in actual fact, they're going to end up with a hybrid model, because certain parts of their estate needs to remain, in a more controlled kind of data center environment, and that's application driven as it happens. So there are a huge range of organisations at various stages. We see that all the time.
Okay, it's been lovely to chat, and some really interesting thoughts and observations as to what's going on there, and hopefully some encouragement for folks to know what's possible. But Andy, thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil.